My name's Jennelle. I am a technical evangelist slash engineer for Microsoft. And today I am here to tell you a little bit about Windows containers. And the question, of course, is it really a container if it has Windows in it? And I'm not here to make you think that whatever workloads you're running in a Linux container that you should, by any stretch of imagination, put it in a Windows containers, because that is silly. But I want to give you a little insight to what a Windows container is, what Microsoft is doing in the container space, and how that might help you if you're working with workloads that are using Windows. A lot of enterprise customers are now starting to look at containers and want to be able to take advantage of some of that density, that ease of deployment, and some of the other features that we get with containers, but for their Windows workloads. So Windows containers exist in the same way that a Linux container does on top of the kernel. The Windows Server container shares the Windows kernel. And one of the other things that we're able to do with our Hyper-V containers is isolate them so a container can run in a very small hypervisor and have its own kernel for additional security. Oops, let's see if it'll work. There we go. The Hyper-V containers also allow the opportunity to run Windows and Linux containers together on top of the same Windows server, an additional way of improving density on your virtual machines. So if you're looking at Windows containers, you want to get started with a Windows container, where can you find one? There's a couple places. First is our Windows Server 2016 long-term branch, which is out now, has been out for several years. And we have two types of images that come down with that, a server core image and a NanoServer image. They're two different sizes, and they have different functionality depending on what your Windows application might do. We also have versions of Windows Server containers through our semi-annual channels, and I'm not going to dive too deep into how we release various versions of Windows, but the semi-annual channel does allow us to make more changes with our software and release more features faster. So if you are looking at doing Windows containers, I highly recommend going with the semi-annual releases because you'll get feature changes faster. We also have Windows Server 2019, which is currently in preview. It's in there. So what can you do with these containers once you think you want to get started with them? The Windows Server Core container is the container you should look at for lift and shift workloads. If you're helping an enterprise start changing some of their on-prem workloads or workloads that they have running on full versions of server, IIS is great for this, Dynamics as well. You can put in containers with some caveats and with some relative ease. If you're looking at doing new development, if you focus on .NET 5 or .NET Core and any new applications, NanoServer is a much smaller footprint, and it's probably the way that you're going to want to go. We've made a bunch of key feature improvements over the last couple months and within our next release. The most current version out there right now is 1709, or the most used version out there right now is 1709, which came out at the end of last year. And we recently released our 1803 version. The numbers come from the year and roughly the month that we release. So 1803 should be March. It came out in April, but things happen. Some of the feature enhancements that we've put in place is volume support, a lot of development within hooking in with Kubernetes. Pod support was in beta at the end of last fall. We now have additional features with Hyper-V isolation with Kubernetes to allow for different ways of orchestrating them. And we did cool things like add tar and curl in NanoServer. So those of you who might be managing two different types of operating systems, maybe some Linux and some Windows workloads, you can use the same tools across both operating systems. And in the future release that's coming in late fall or closer to the winter of this year, we're making some additional Hyper-V improvements, and we're also starting to optimize the image. What changed with NanoServer? When we first did this a couple years ago, the NanoServer, you could run NanoServer as your host, and you could also run it as your container, and it was kind of confusing, and it was actually still kind of big. So with 1709, We no longer support that as a container host. It's also 70% smaller than the previous container image, so we're really getting much closer to the size of a download that you would see with a Linux image. Obviously, we have all of those additional features that we added in, but the other big thing that we took out is we completely changed the servicing stack. If you're familiar with deploying with Linux containers, when you want to upgrade the base operating system underneath your container, you simply roll out a new container with a new base. We wanted to get away from the Windows-esque servicing stack that we had, which was upgrades and patching and things like that. So we no longer upgrade NanoServer with that servicing stack. We completely took it out, and if you need to change your NanoServer image, you redeploy with an updated base image. We've also made a lot of image size improvements from 2016. You can see the server core, which is going to be biggish anyway, has come down from 5 gigs of the download size to 1.6. And the NanoServer has gone from 393 megabytes down to sub 100. And we keep making those improvements so that people who are looking at using Windows containers to improve their deployment speeds will be able to take advantage of that. So if you're getting started with these, where can you deploy them? Obviously, you can deploy them on-prem using a supported host operating system. You can also use Service Fabric, which is one of our orchestrators. You can do it on Azure using VMs with the supported host OS. And you can also use Azure Container Instances as a quick way to deploy a Windows container. We're also looking at allowing you to be able to use Windows containers in our managed Kubernetes service as well, and that is currently in private preview for anybody who's interested in trying that out. If you want to run a Windows container, a lot of it is about what your host operating system is. If you're going to do bare metal, you need Server 2016, either core or full, or Windows Server 1709 or 1803. Or Windows 10, as you can do Windows containers on Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise for development purposes. If you're going to run it on top of a VM, same OSs as above. You want to make sure you have enough RAM. And if you want to take advantage of Hyper-V containers, you need to have nested virtualization enabled so that you can run that other mini hypervisor to run the kernel inside. And your base image choices are Server Core or NanoServer. When people approach me and ask, I've got a legacy application perhaps that I want to put into a container, my first question is, can you run it on Server Core? There's a lot of applications that need underlying features of the full desktop experience of Windows Server, and that is not going to be easy to containerize because many of those features are missing from Core. So the first way to get started is to make sure your application can just run on Core as a starting point, and then work on making any additional container-specific changes regarding communications, things like that. Version compatibility is a challenge. One of the things that Microsoft has always been sort of expected to do and has supported for our customer base is a lot of backwards compatibility. And with our container deployments, we've actually kind of broken backward compatibility on purpose so that the newest features don't rely on older versions of a container image or older versions of the operating system. But because of that, it's a bit of a mind shift, and you need to make sure that older container images, if you want to use an older container image on a new host, you have to put it in Hyper-V isolation mode to run on a newer host OS. And if you want to run the newest container, it has to be on the newest host OS right now. So we're working on improving that experience and making it less reliant on exact version compatibility, and it's getting better. But it is a bit of a mind shift for a lot of our customers who are very used to newer things being able, or older things being able to run easily on newer versions of the operating system. Images that are available, if you go to Docker Hub, we've got 2 sets of images available. We have Windows Server Core. The long-term servicing branch versions are available, as well as 1709 and 1803, and same for NanoServer. One of the interesting things that comes up with Windows workloads and Windows containers is, surprise, surprise, people who are using Windows workloads want their containers to do Windowsy things. If they wanted their containers to do Linuxy things, we tell them to build a Linux container. So one of the Windowsy things that people want their Windows workloads to do is actually be joined to the domain. And you can join them to the domain. Yes, sort of. It depends, which always seems to be the standard systems administrator answer to every question. It depends. And the way that we do that is actually with a group managed service account. So so Docker has made some feature enhancements to allow the ability to wrap a different credential specification around the container that it runs under. And it takes advantage of a domain-joined container host to access domain-specific permissions to do things. IIS works generally pretty well. Some of the other legacy workloads have some challenges to them. So Windows containers are essentially maturing. And I actually had a discussion with a customer yesterday he was like, well, why aren't they as good as Linux containers yet? And my answer was, well, Linux has had, 15-year head start, 20-year head start on this. So, we definitely have some work to do with Windows containers, but we are hearing a lot with our customers who want to be able to start taking advantage of a lot of these DevOps practices. They want to be able to quickly deploy applications, get that same developer experience, get that same continuous integration and deployment experience that Linux users are seeing, and be able to do that with the same workloads. It's not necessarily the best lift and shift solution. Not every Windows workload can be easily wrapped into a container with a bow and have it work, but it is a starting point, and it is a goal for many of our customers. So with that, the question is it really a container when it has some Windows in it? And I think, yes, it is. But as I mentioned, we're there, and we're working on it. And if you're doing any legacy workloads on Windows, or you're working for an organization that's using both Linux and Windows, Windows containers can be a viable option for some of your workloads. Thank you.